Witch Hunters have always been a cool and iconic part of Warhammer lore, as well as fantasy as a whole. And today on the Hobby Grotto, I'm going to show you a fast and classic scheme featuring Jelsen Darrock from Curse City. I like to try and save time as much as possible when painting by using an overall base coat on the model when I can, so I'm starting here with an overbrush of Rhinox hide, because this is not only going to be perfect for all the leather, but it's also going to work as a great base for our other colours too. Brown is an excellent base coat to work up from really, so if you're painting a model like this that already has a lot of brown, it's a bonus. It's almost like a dirty Xenothol in a way. He actually kind of looks like he's made of chocolate. And in case you're wondering what an overbrush is, it's just a heavier dry brush where we're leaving a bit more of the paint on the brush and getting an overall more consistent coat across the model while still retaining some of that shading. There are a couple of details I'm painting here with XV88, which is another great base for a range of colours and is also keeping with these overall brown grim tones we want for the model. I'm also base coating the face with XV88 now because it's covered in a lot of shadow, and I think XV88 can be a good way to start skin tones like this. Red is of course a classic way to add a bit of colour to something like a Witch Hunter, and works nicely with the theme of the model, as well as the brown tones we've established, but you can use any colour for these details really. I think dark rich purples as well as emerald green can look very cool on Witch Hunters. A lot of colours can create a nice contrast with the dark natural browns on a Witch Hunter mini, while adding a bit more flair and helping the mini to stand out on the tabletop. To add a bit more visual interest to the model, I'm also painting some details with Incubi darkness. This is a great colour, it's got a really interesting tone that can spice up a paint job, and I also think it works really well with a dark red like Khorne red. I often paint these kinds of details black on minis, but this is a bit more fun for a character model, and also makes his weapons a bit more classy looking. Now I'm painting his gloves and boots black to again create a bit of visual interest, because if we use too much brown, the parts of the model are not going to separate to the eye as much on the tabletop, and this way we're adding more colours while also keeping with the overall dark tone of the model. Next up are the metallics. I'm using Iron Warriors here, and I'm just going straight over the brown. No need to paint any of this black, which is usually, a good thing to do with metallics, because this brown is honestly dark enough and will do everything a black undercoat would do, particularly once the wash is over the top. Iron Warriors is probably my favourite metallic silver for more grimdark minis like this. Anything too bright is going to be really visually distracting, and we don't want that. And if you're enjoying the video as well, don't forget to like and subscribe. That stuff really does help the Hobby Grotto so much. With the base coats now complete, it's time to add some shading to the mini, and Nuln oil is particularly good here for dark and grimy minis like a Witch Hunter. I like to use a big brush for washes like this to save time, but if you're using a big brush, you want to be making sure the wash isn't pooling anywhere, because you're generally putting on quite a lot of shade, and you want to get this early as you don't want to be messing around with the wash too much as it's drying, particularly seeing as the new Nuln oil behaves much more like a contrast paint. You can see here now it's dry how much the wash has added to a mini like this, but now it's time to build up those highlight layers. Starting with Rhinox hide, I'm coming back and reapplying all the base coats to build on that first level of shading, as well as neaten up any areas where the wash has pooled or dried on areas I don't want it to be. I'm having a lot of fun painting these Curse City minis. They've got that great evocative gothic feel to them, and they remind me a lot of one of my favourite GW games of all time, Mordheim. Incidentally, also featuring Witch Hunters. I think some of these minis like Jelsen Darrock would be right at home there. Of course, it's not always necessary to come back in this step on the small details, but I still like to do it for the sake of completion, and all areas, no matter how small, do benefit from some tidying and brightening after the wash in my opinion. It's always going to help build that shading and make the transition to edge highlights smoother. On this particular model, the face is quite obscured, so I'm going to get this out of the way first, because it's always good to work inside out with this stuff so we don't get flesh paint everywhere. And if you want to learn more about different kinds of skin tones, don't forget to check out my skin tutorial, but I'm making these highlights nice and bright to help the face stand out a bit more. Before I add some painted highlights with Ironbreaker, I'm giving the larger areas a quick and targeted dry brush with this paint, just to save a bit of time. This also has the added effect of creating a nice burnish look on the metals due to the micro texture that dry brushing creates. As I mentioned, I'm then coming back and painting on some manual highlights, and I like to do this even though the paint is metallic and reflective because it really emphasizes the edges and creates some nice shine. That's all you really need to do with metallics after a wash, just give them a couple of nice defined highlights and let the metallic pigment in the paint do the rest. I'm highlighting the brown leather areas in two different ways to add a bit more variety to the miniature and help break up some of these brown patches a little. The first is a mix of Rhinox hide and XV88 to create a paler leather, and I'm using this on the bag and pouches because they seem like a nice part of the model to create some visual difference between the darker leather of the coat and straps. I'm then adding a final highlight to all these areas with pure XV88. You could even go further and mix a bit of bone or white with this for some more extreme highlights, but none of these areas are a focal point of the Mini, so I'm just going to leave it there. For the darker leather, I've lightened Rhinox hide slightly with some bone, so as not to wash out the rich colour of Rhinox hide too much. Bone is really good for this. And I'm just hitting the raised areas with this, as I want to keep the dark look overall, and it's really easy to get carried away with highlights and lighten the colour too much. Some extreme highlights can be added with a mix that's even heavier on the bone. It's really important to keep this to just the extreme edges as it's quite a light colour, and you don't want your Witch Hunter to start looking like Tron. I've mixed a bit of bone with the XV88 for the wooden stakes, and I'm just painting this on in some light layers to build up a bit more of a three-dimensional wooden look here, concentrating this on the points and flat ends as well. You can even paint this on in lines if you're careful to create a bit of wood grain texture. A couple of final highlights here, and you can really do as much highlighting as you want, but I'm keeping it fairly minimal because none of these areas are focal points, and I'm really painting this Mini for tabletop, so I don't want to get too carried away. But I always think the best thing with highlights is to base them on what you're using the Mini for, because they can be a time sink no doubt, and for rank and file or tabletop standard Minis, a lot of it's not going to be noticed. And that's the Witch Hunter, one of my favourite kinds of models from the Warhammer world to paint. They're just so cool. As always, thanks for watching. Why don't you go check out some of these other videos on the screen here, and we'll see you next time on the Hobby Grotto.